Louisa.
First of all, I want to say that it was really nice to see this paper, and it felt like the sort of right time. But it feels like
Which paper are you referring to?
Oh, sorry, that's a very good question. The Performance Improvement Plan.
Okay.
And it felt very important because some of the reasons we've discussed. And I suppose some of my questions you'll be able to sort of answer, I'm sure. But when we look at the changing contact channel mix, for example, and we say that people are using health and symptom checkers, I think this question might have been asked before, but are we sure that there's not a new sort of population using the health and symptom checkers that's different to the people who would phone? I mean, what proportion of that usage can we say has been removed from the calling?
I don't think we can answer that.
Okay.
Because we don't ask people to identify themselves,
yeah.
as you'll all know from having used the health and symptoms checkers, until the end, if a callback is required. Now, one of the things that we are considering doing is asking for that information up front rather than at the end.
Okay.
But we don't know how much is substitution or how much is additional contact. Okay.
And then it seemed to me that this business of we're an out-of-hours service has always been a tension, really, and that seems the most essential thing. And I suppose there are concerns that it's put in the hands of a team manager who's got so much to struggle with and is relatively new and may not necessarily have the sort of experience or the length of time dealing with the team to ask something that's so sort of important. And I just wondered if we are supporting them enough. And then my last question was around the changing case mix, and this has been going on since June, we're saying, but we often talk about December. Was this a pattern from June, do we think, or are we very influenced by December and an old person with an elderly person with a sort of cough and shortness of breath obviously becomes urgent pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. So is this a pattern that we've been seeing? I mean, I remember when I went to visit Milton Keynes and talked to somebody rostering then, that there were issues around, getting people to think of this as an out-of-hours service.
Right. Okay. So firstly, the team managers are
which we sort of
are not. They're not new though, because vast majority of people who are our new cohort of team managers were previously team leaders or clinical team leaders, and in some instances we have recruited people. We've just finished recruiting into the vacancies now, and the vast majority of those have come from frontline staff who have sought promotion, etc. So they're not new, but they have got now focused time. In terms of implementing this change in relation to the rostering for the weekend working, we considered whether we should implement it as a central project, which is what we did last time, or whether it was better to implement it through the person that's closest to you, which is your team manager. Yes. And that's why we took the decision to implement it through the team manager structure rather than just being something, although I sent an email to everybody in the organisation, including yourselves, around the change, just to trigger the discussions, as it were. In terms of what the team managers, how they're being supported, then all of the performance managers who are their managers are on hand to help them, and we have got rostering champions amongst the performance managers as well. Plus, we've created a comprehensive Q&A and a set of resources that the team managers can use in their discussions. But we took the decision as that the team managers were the right people to do this discussion rather than any other place, which we didn't really have that luxury when we implemented the rostering revolution the first time around, because the team managers hadn't been recruited to their new posts at that time, and we were in the middle of a consultation with them.
There was a question on acuity.
Acuity.
So that's maybe a Trish question.
Yeah. Sorry, you'll have to repeat that.
There have been sort of issues around meeting KPI since June. When we talk about it, we often talk about the acuity in December. I just wondered whether this is something that's been going on from June, the change in pattern of calls.
There has been a steady incline in our urgent referrals since the June period. We initially thought it was due to the introduction of our new CSPT, and we've analysed that data, and we do believe with the health and symptom checkers and that steady increase, more over the winter period granted, but we believe because of the health and symptom checkers, what is coming through on the telephone is more urgent. So it's a combination, it's a complexity of issues really.
Okay, thank you. Steve.
Yeah, I also went to Chatham last week with Lynette for the day, and I spent about 3 hours listening to calls. Sorry?
No, that was just, Peter was just saying they've had a double dose at Chatham.
Yeah.
Double the joy.
Double the joy, yeah. It was a very good day actually. And I spent 3 or 4 hours listening to calls and talking to some nurse advisors and health advisors. And I realise it's only a sample of about 4, but the comments I had were that the stress levels in the job had gone up over the last 3 or 4 months. And the reason was that the calls that were coming in were more complex, more acute, and the time taken on calls had gone up. And of course, people are judged partly their KPIs on call times. And the question I have is, are we flexible enough to actually look at those KPIs and make sure that they reflect the reality of the caseload? Because again, to go back in a loop, I just wondered to what level that's also contributing to the absence levels.
Yeah.
If people are feeling more stressful.
It looks like Trish and Lynette both very keen to answer that question.
I'll answer the
You can
first.
answer it, all right.
Well, I'm going to help answer it.
Okay, so we've got 3 answers coming up. You've,
I think I need
the
to
bit,
chickens.
Chair, I'd like to contribute is when we are performance manage our staff regarding their clinical performance KPIs, we have guidelines, a guidance of somebody's case mix, but rather than have a one size fits all, i.e. your call length should be X and your clinical sorting should be Y, you should have X number of urgent referrals, Y number of lower referrals. We look at the individual's rosters, how often they work. We look at their length of experience, both within the clinical setting as a registered nurse, if it's a nurse, and how much experience they've got within NHS Direct, because we identify that the greater the experience within NHS Direct, as well as their wider NHS experience, and depending on their shift patterns, gives a very different case mix of what their clinical sorting would be. So, for example, a nurse with lots of experience working mainly out of hours would have a higher urgent referral rate than somebody who worked in hours and would have more of a routine or a self-care clinical sorting pattern. So we do consider exactly those issues.
Lynette, do you still want to come in?
Well, I've got something which is at the other side of that, which is about affordability, really, of the service. And this is important, obviously, in a 111 world as well, insofar as, I think as the paper says, I shall just remind myself, but, and I think I've mentioned this before, every extra second of average handling time, and it is an average that we're looking at when we're looking at the gross KPIs rather than the individual performance that Trish has talked about. But every second of average handling time that we increase, that a nurse, we need 2.5 FTEs more nurse advisors. And so what we're actually talking about is an average handling time in the order of 11.5 minutes per call, versus a target of about 10.5 minutes per call. So it's a big extra time. And so, you know, we might need to spend more time with some patients, but there are a lot of patients that don't need that same amount of time as well. So what we have to have is a target to set the budget somewhere, and we think that on average that should be in the order of 10 minutes a call.
Seems to me that that's a very healthy tension that we should be working around.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear both of those points of view actually around this very important question. Peter.
Yeah, I only have one example of one actually, a team manager who spoke to me about his impressions of the current reviews that he did. He said to me that because of the size of the number of people now he's looking at, and he can plan his time better, he's able to see staff in an unrushed and more thorough way than he has in the past. And so the review meetings have taken have been much more towards developmental than anything that has happened before. And and he was encouraged by that conversation and the way that his life had changed, which I thought was worthy of mention. But it is an example of one, so I have to say we have to be a bit careful with it. But there it is.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, well, I'm going to ask a final question and then put it together. So I'd like to come back to Louisa's point about the conversation between Louisa and Renette about asking team leaders to negotiate with our staff so that we move more people onto weekend working or within their contracts. And I think that I very much support the idea that it's the frontline person, the frontline manager who's doing that. But I wonder, some people will find that easier than others. Mm-hmm. Are we tracking carefully whether all those conversations have taken place and how successful team leaders are in negotiating with their staff, so that people who find it easier can coach and support those who find it more challenging to have those conversations with their team members?
Yes, we are, but not at my level, at the performance manager level, which is, I think, also the right place where that needs to be managed, rather than it being a centralist doctrine.
But at the end of the day, we'll know whether all of those conversations have taken place, and we'll know perhaps the range of how successful people have been in negotiating the change that we wanted to see. Do we know that? Because I think perhaps we should.
The rate in terms of...
But if I have 20 people in my team, whether I've managed to get 5 of them to move to what we wanted or 12.
Okay, so everybody will move to 5 in 8. I think what's actually being discussed through the team managers, the timing by which that gets done. Okay. And we've set ourselves the objectives to get that done within the next 3 months, which we think is enough time for people to make alternative arrangements around what other things they might want to do.
Okay. So we'll check that has happened.
We'll check that. Oh, absolutely, check that has happened. Yes.
Thank you.
But not whether people are struggling per se, because I'd like that to be managed within the performance manager, because that's what they're held to account to deliver to support their teams.
Fine, thank you. Well, we've had a good conversation about performance, which I think is appropriate given the change in our management structure and the performance challenges that we're still facing. So I'm going to suggest that we take a 5-minute break now, partly because we're slightly ahead of time, and importantly so that we can see whether we can arrange the room a little bit better so that visitors can...
I was going to suggest, because I can see etched on the faces of our visitors in the room, they're struggling to hear. Am I right? And what I was going to suggest was that if we position you round the board table at this end, you'll be able to hear better, and you can. It'll be a bit more convenient. So that's what I was going to suggest we do now.
So could we help do that just in the next 5 minutes while the rest of us just stretch our legs? Yeah. Thank you very much. We'll be back in at 26 minutes past.